Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to give it a few more minutes to allow any late joiners to dial onto the call before I kick off. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you wherever you are in the world. Thank you again for joining today's webinar on the Mobile Gender Gap Report 2020. My name's Oliver Roundtree. I'm Senior Insights Manager in the Connected Women team at the GSMA, and I'm lead author for this report, so we'll be presenting the findings today. So we will spend the majority of the hour running through the findings of the research, but we should have around 15 or 20 minutes towards the end for questions. So do feel free to add your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section as we run through, and I will address those at the end of the session. So on to today's topic. So of course, as we all know right now, connectivity has become more important than it ever has been in the past. During this time of COVID-19, connectivity is what allows us to stay in contact with family and friends, but also crucially allows us to continue to work, to engage in economic activity, for people to continue their education, and to allow our lives to carry on in some semblance of normality wherever that's possible. But especially as we look to the solutions during coronavirus and also to the economic problems that we face after coronavirus, it's really, really crucial to remember that connectivity is a really essential tool that will help both in our response and in our follow-up. But it's also important to remember that connectivity is not yet equal. And in particular, there is a substantial mobile gender gap that prevents equitable access and use of mobile services for women. And that's what we're going to focus in on today. Before I jump into the findings from the research, I'm just going to give a little bit of context on the Connected Women team and how we work. So the Connected Women team within the GSMA, we really have two areas of main focus: reducing the gender gap in mobile internet usage in low and middle income countries, and reducing the gender gap in mobile money usage in low and middle income countries, as well as reducing the gender gap in usage of services that use those platforms. To do that, we have three main approaches and work streams that work towards that objective. The first is our advocacy work. So within advocacy, we drive awareness and prioritization of the mobile gender gap amongst our stakeholders. And we do this by leading and participating in alliances with various different organizations who are working to address this gap, convening a variety of different stakeholders who are also working on this topic, capacity building, for example, with policymakers and regulators, as well as other organizations, and through engaging in important policy-related discussions to advance the global conversation around the mobile gender gap. Through our market engagement workstream, we work closely with the mobile industry to have a real impact on the ground when it comes to the mobile gender gap. So we invite mobile operators to make formal commitments to close or reduce the gender gap in their mobile internet, mobile money, or certain use cases, customer bases. And then once they have made those commitments, we support them in reducing and closing the gender gap on the ground in their market. And then finally, the insights workstream. So the Connected Women team develops insights and thought leadership on the mobile gender gap, including its size, the drivers of that gender gap, the rationale for and approaches to reducing that gap. And of course, this gender gap report is a key example of these kinds of insights. What we're working towards ultimately is increasing access to and use of mobile services by women and delivering to women the benefits that can be achieved through connectivity. But on top of that, we're also working to drive growth of the mobile industry as well as the economy more broadly, where connectivity is becoming a really crucial enabler of economic activity worldwide. And then finally, of course, we're working towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, again, for which connectivity is a hugely important enabler. And we're really proud through the work of the Connected Women program over the last 10 years to have supported our partners in reaching around 50 million additional women with mobile services over that time. So now to get into the research a little bit more. So just by way of background, the Mobile Gender Gap Report series is an annual report that we have been publishing for the last 3 years, covering the mobile gender gap. So our first report was published back in February of 2018, but this also builds on previous research the program has been conducting over the last 10 years. The objectives of this research, of this report series, is really to size and track the mobile gender gap report over time, the mobile gender gap over time. And we really want to ensure that there is a wealth of data available on this topic. And in particular, now that we have 3 years of reports published on this topic, we're able to look a lot more at the comparison as to how the mobile gender gap is changing over time. Secondly, we really set out to understand gender differences in usage of mobile, above and beyond just uptake of basic services, but how are men and women making use of those services differently, and how is it impacting relatively on their lives? Of course, then we need to identify the barriers that prevent women's equal access to and use of mobile services. And this is absolutely crucial if we want to achieve our final objective, which is to inform action to close the gender gap. So really to try and provide an evidence base for all of the organizations who are working on this topic, whether within the private sector or governments, NGOs, or the international community. And I'll close out this presentation with some recommendations for you all to take away to your own work on what can be done to understand and address the mobile gender gap. The research we're going to be talking through today is based on the results of the GSMA Intelligence Consumer Survey 2019. And this was conducted in 15 countries, 15 low and middle income countries towards the end of 2019. It's also important to note that it also builds on findings from the GSMA Intelligence Consumer Survey 2018 and 2017. And across all of those 3 surveys, we've covered a total of 28 low and middle income countries. All of these surveys have a nationally representative sample of adults aged 18 plus, with at least 1,000 individuals interviewed with face-to-face interviews per country. So across the 3 years that we've been running this survey, we have covered a total of countries representing over 75% of the adult population of low and middle income countries. So wide coverage to this survey, but where we don't have countries covered, we use an econometric extrapolation model that allows us to estimate the values for those non-surveyed countries. So moving on to the findings of the research. And really, I think one of the most crucial things that we found this year was that we passed a real milestone when it came to mobile internet connectivity. By the end of 2019, this was the first year where we had seen that over 50% of women in lower middle income countries are now using mobile internet. So this is quite an incredible milestone. And you can see over the last couple of years, there's been a relatively quick pace of growth of that connectivity for women. So, this is incredible reach for a technology that can provide wide access to a range of different services and information. So having over half of the women in lower middle income countries accessing this is really an important milestone to note. However, we also observed that there remains a significant gender gap in access to mobile internet. Indeed, in 2019, close to 68% of men across lower middle income countries use mobile internet. So still a substantial disparity. It's worth noting here that I'll be talking about mobile internet throughout this presentation, as this is the specific focus of this research. But it's also important to know that mobile is the sort of first and primary means of internet connectivity for the majority of people in lower middle income countries. So according to ITU data, 87% of broadband internet connections in developing countries are over mobile. So, it's really crucial to understand the dynamics of mobile internet, as this really is the primary means of connectivity for the vast majority of people in the global south. So, as I say, there remains a substantial gender gap in mobile internet usage across lower middle income countries. And on this diagram here, you can see the gender gap for each region, with the grey circles showing the gender gap in 2017 and the purple circles showing the gender gap in 2019. So across lower middle income countries in total, women are 20% less likely than men to use mobile internet, which is really still a substantial disparity. However, the more positive news here is that we've also seen quite a rapid pace of reduction in that gender gap. So since 2017, we found that there was a 7 percentage point reduction in the gender gap, down from 27%. Now, the majority of that closure has actually been driven by South Asia, where we have consistently observed the widest gender gaps of any region, but also the most progress in closure of the gap. So you'll see down at the bottom there, in 2017, there was a 67% gender gap in mobile internet use in South Asia, whereas in 2019, that had reduced down to 51%. So quite impressive progress. And a lot of that is driven by changing market dynamics in the region, whereby data in particular has become much more affordable in many South Asian countries, which has removed or mitigated what has historically proven to be a disproportionate barrier to women's access to mobile internet, which is affordability. It's also true that there's been much wider access to very low cost LTE-enabled devices. So one key example being the Jio phone in India, which is an LTE-enabled device which can be purchased for less than $10 at the point of sale. So really a massive reduction in the upfront cost of an LTE-enabled device, and that's helped to drive down that gender gap. But you'll also observe that in other regions, we've not seen so much progress. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen the gender gap remaining pretty static over the time that we have been looking at this topic, although there has been growth in both male and female access to mobile internet, but the relative gap has not reduced. Now, it's important to remember that underpinning that mobile internet gender gap, there does still remain a gender gap in mobile ownership. So looking here at the trends both for mobile ownership and mobile internet use, we can observe a few things. Generally, the gender gap in mobile ownership tends to be smaller than the gender gap in mobile internet use. For example, you can see across lower middle income countries overall, we observed this year an 8% gender gap in mobile ownership. You can also see in the bottom left here that across low and middle income countries, 82% of women now own a mobile phone, which is an incredible figure and does represent an incredibly high level of uptake for any technology. But it does also mean that 393 million women remain unconnected. And I think this is a really crucial thing for us to remember. Again, particularly as we try and roll out services to try and mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 and try and explore how digital innovations can help to achieve that. Really crucial to remember that that many of the most vulnerable individuals, in particular women, are going to be exactly those people who do not own a mobile. So any service that is presupposing universal connectivity in how it is delivered is going to be systematically missing out a really important segment of the population, which I think is really crucial to bear in mind. So looking into some of these country trends, again, you'll observe for most countries, the gender gap in mobile ownership is smaller than the gender gap in mobile internet use. And indeed, levels of mobile ownership tend to be, across most markets, getting pretty high at this point. But we do note some objections, some exceptions, particularly for women. So looking, for example, at Pakistan, only 50% of women now own a mobile in Pakistan and 63% of women in India. So this is, a region where we do still observe quite a substantial gender gap in mobile ownership, with much higher levels of ownership for men. Whereas for other countries, such as those in sub-Saharan Africa, we see a much smaller gender gap in mobile ownership. Whereas if we look across to the gender gap in mobile internet use, in fact, in those countries where we observed almost no gender gap in mobile ownership, such as Kenya and Nigeria, there is still quite a substantial gender gap in mobile internet use. So 34% in Kenya and 29% in Nigeria. While in those South Asian markets that we observe, the levels of mobile internet use remain really quite low still. So in Pakistan, we see only 19% of women using mobile internet compared to 37% of men. And in India, 21% of women versus 42% of men. So really still some substantial gender disparities. And we tend to find that the gender gaps are often widest in countries with a lower GDP per capita, whereas higher GDP per capita countries, for example, amongst this sample at least, represented by South Africa here, we tend to see smaller gender gaps overall. So having given that top level view of the state of the mobile gender gap right now, I'm going to jump into a little bit more detail on how women's digital inclusion is changing over time and what we've really observed over the last several years of conducting this survey. So I'm going to start off by presenting a framework which we regularly use, which is our very simplistic mobile internet user journey, which starts at mobile ownership as the first stage, moves on to awareness of mobile internet, then on to mobile internet adoption, and then finally regular mobile internet use, which can encompass a very wide range of different services. I should say here that we're certainly not trying to suggest that this is universally the path to mobile internet adoption and to mobile internet use. It can take different forms, and of course, some people can be aware of mobile internet before they even own a device. But we generally find that this is a useful way to understand the journey for many users. So one thing that we do generally observe is that the gender gap widens typically along each stage of this user journey, as you've already seen on the previous slide, where the gender gap was wider for mobile internet use than it was for mobile ownership. Now, it's really important then to understand what are the barriers that are preventing equitable use at each stage of this user journey. So what we have here is across the 15 countries that we surveyed this year, the top barriers to mobile ownership here on the left in these two columns, and to mobile internet adoption in those two columns under 3. So there's some important changes that we've observed over the last year even just the last year of doing this research, there have been some important shifts. But starting on mobile ownership, there was more continuity when it came to the top barriers for mobile ownership. The same as for in 2018 and 2019, we found that affordability remained the top barrier to mobile ownership overall. That is primarily affordability of a handset, while literacy and digital skills presented an important second barrier, which really is still key in many, many countries. While safety and security was an important barrier in some countries, particularly in Latin America. One change that we observed was an increase in the relative importance of family disapproval as a barrier, particularly for women. But it is important to observe that this is a barrier that we see being very prevalent in a smaller number of markets, but not so much of a consideration, at least according to our quantitative survey in other countries. So, for example, in Pakistan, it is one of the absolute main barriers, with over 30% of women reporting this as the top barrier for their mobile ownership. It's important to note that that's not to say that it's not an important barrier in other countries. And indeed, the effects of social norms is often a really crucial consideration that underpins all of these barriers. But it's not necessarily something that shows up in a quantitative study. Looking across to mobile internet then, and it's important to know the sample on these barriers for both men and women, where we asked the top barriers to mobile internet usage for those mobile users who were aware of mobile internet. So it does exclude a portion of the population who don't use a mobile or are not aware of the mobile internet at all. And we saw a couple of really important changes here. The real most notable one was that relevance, which had always been a key barrier to mobile internet use. That is to say, the perceived relevance of internet to one's day-to-day lives, where people just perhaps did not feel like using internet was something that was helpful for them. That really saw a substantial decline year on year in terms of its importance as a barrier. And I think that's really reflective of a growth and proliferation of locally relevant and local language content, driven by video online, which I'll get onto in a little bit more detail in a few slides. But I think a really fascinating trend to see that people are really seeing an increasing level of awareness of the relevance of internet in their day-to-day lives. By contrast, literacy and digital skills remained the top barrier overall to mobile internet use amongst this sample, both for men and for women. So this encompasses both traditional literacy as well as the ability to use a basic phone and the ability to use the internet specifically. And this really is a crucial barrier that's important to be aware of. Again, particularly where possible services are being rolled out over mobile, that levels of digital skills still remain low for many people, and it tends to be a disproportionate barrier for women. So anybody rolling out services, particularly again to mitigate the effects of COVID-19, should be aware of those potential levels of lower digital skills. And again, affordability is the second most important barrier for mobile internet use. So a crucial barrier, absolutely, but overall slightly less so than literacy and digital skills. And with affordability being particularly around the affordability of an internet-enabled handset. Safety and security, we did observe in relative terms having an increase in importance year on year, although this was mostly due to simply the decline in the importance of relevance. Actually, it was more that a higher proportion of respondents were citing literacy and digital skills and affordability as the most important barriers, even though safety and security increased in its ranking level year on year. So moving on from the barriers, I think another really crucial change that we observed year on year was, and indeed over the last 2 years, was a growth in levels of awareness of mobile internet. And you'll remember from the user journey that I presented a couple of slides ago, we see that mobile internet awareness is a really important step along that user journey, and one where we have historically observed some very important gaps. And I think it's fair to consider awareness as a barrier in and of itself to mobile internet use, albeit one that we can't consider alongside the other barriers, because by definition, we can't ask about the barriers to mobile internet use of somebody who is not aware or does not understand what mobile internet is. So over the last couple of years, in several of the markets that we've surveyed, we have seen an absolutely huge increase in levels of awareness of mobile internet, particularly for women. So again, I'll call out the examples from South Asia where we see some of the most striking numbers. So in 2017 in India, we observed that only 19% of women who we spoke to were aware of the internet and of the fact that it could be used on a mobile phone. In our 2019 survey, we found this number had increased to 50%. So really incredible growth. And again, looking to Pakistan, that number had increased from 39% to 70%. And you'll also observe that these increases for women really reduced the gap and disparity with the levels of awareness for men, so becoming much more equitable. So again, I think something to be aware of, again, for any organization considering their actions during or following on from COVID-19 and whether something is appropriate to be delivered over mobile. While I urge some caution around being aware of gender gaps, it is reassuring to know that levels of awareness of mobile internet overall, and I think understanding of it as a value proposition is increasing quite quickly over time. Now, I think one of the other really striking changes that we've observed the last couple of years, which I've alluded to a little bit earlier on, is the absolutely meteoric growth in video consumption amongst both men and women. But I think it's really interesting to observe that those levels are relative to the other data that we'll look at throughout this presentation, relatively equitable. So what I'm showing here is the percentage of both male and female mobile internet users who watch video on their mobile, free video, on at least a monthly basis. So, of course, important to be aware that this is only representative of mobile internet users, which is already a smaller proportion of women. But amongst those users, we actually see much more parity than we might otherwise expect in levels of video consumption, and really, really rapid growth over the last few years. So, for example, in India, which is, of course, the example I keep going back to because we see these massive changes over the last few years, the levels were of women watching video on mobile were 42% in 2017, and that's increased hugely to 74% in 2019. But then this is not only a trend in South Asia. Looking at Kenya, for example, 28% of women were viewing video content on mobile in 2017, which has increased to 51% in just 2 years. So really, really rapid growth. And again, I think something to really bear in mind that we consistently see in our research the overwhelming popularity and accessibility of video content, especially when it can be in local languages. This can help to overcome issues of digital literacy when trying to navigate text-based content, but also traditional literacy, of course, because somebody can enjoy a video even if they could not read written content. So again, for anybody considering how they should be delivering content at this time, video is a really powerful and popular means to do that has a great reach both for men but also for women. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the factors that are maybe preventing equitable use of mobile for women. And I've alluded to this a little bit earlier on, but one of the crucial things to understand when it comes to equitable mobile internet use by women is the landscape in terms of handset ownership. We talked about the mobile ownership gender gap overall, but it's important to look beyond this and look at the type of device owned, because here we see another substantial gender gap that exists. And indeed, actually, across lower middle income countries, we observed that, like mobile internet, women are 20% less likely than men to own a smartphone as well. So that gender gap tracks very closely to the mobile internet gender gap. And so you'll see there are some really substantial disparities in levels of smartphone ownership in many of the countries that we're looking at here. So for example, in India, it's at 14% for women versus 37% of men. And Nigeria, where we don't see a particularly wide gender gap in mobile ownership, but however, only 39% of women own a smartphone compared to 48% of men. So this is a really, really important stage of that user journey to understand that, while women may be at increasingly high levels owning a mobile, they are disproportionately not owning a smartphone, which provides much wider access to a range of services. So, and to get into that in a little bit more detail here. So again, I'm coming back to that user journey framework that I presented at the start of this section. So you'll see at the top here, we have each of the chevrons representing a stage of that user journey through from mobile ownership over to regular mobile internet use. However, what we've done here is we've broken out that user journey by handset type. So where stage one of that user journey could be achieved by acquiring a basic phone, a feature phone, or a smartphone. And then once we've differentiated those cohorts, we follow through how their usage and what the proportions of men and women are who are reaching each of the next and subsequent stages of that user journey. So the charts that you see in each of the chevrons below represent the spread of proportions across the 15 countries that we surveyed in the consumer survey. So with the lower number on the left being the lowest value we observed across all countries, and the highest value on the right being the highest value across all of those countries. So a few things to pull out here. So starting with awareness of mobile internet, and you'll of course observe that awareness of mobile internet is much, much higher for those who own a smartphone, which is perhaps not overly surprising given that many might have acquired a smartphone because they wanted to access mobile internet. So whereas levels of awareness of mobile internet is quite a lot lower and varies a lot more amongst basic phone owners. Now we look to mobile internet adoption, and I should note here, of course, that amongst basic phone owners, our definition of mobile internet adoption allows for those who are using mobile internet on somebody else's device. So while it's not possible for a basic phone owner to use it on their own device, they can still fall within this bucket. However, levels of mobile internet use are unsurprisingly very, very low for basic phone owners, suggesting that if you don't own an internet-enabled device, it's very difficult for you to borrow one to allow you to get online. Jumping over though to smartphones, we see across almost all of the countries that we've surveyed, the vast majority of smartphone owners are using mobile internet on a pretty regular basis. So really reinforcing the importance of the smartphone for getting people online, which again, I'm sure won't be a huge surprise to many of you. And then moving on to step 4 of that user journey. And here's where we really try and capture not just adoption, but the breadth and depth of usage of mobile internet services. And here I think there's a really, again, striking difference for those using a basic phone or a feature phone versus those using a smartphone, where they're consistently using, several use cases on a weekly basis, up to 7.3 in the highest market that we observed. And this is an average across all of these device type owners in the countries that we surveyed. I think one final point to highlight here is that while there is still a gender gap in each of these chevrons that we look at, it does actually, when we control for handset type, it does reduce that gender gap substantially. So what that means is that a lot of the gender gap in terms of mobile internet use is really coming from the device type owned. So if we could provide more equal access to smartphones, it is likely that we would see much more equitable use of mobile internet as well. Although, of course, it is difficult to say with certainty whether the causal direction goes that way. And indeed, it might be because higher income individuals are both owning a smartphone as well as tending to use a wider range of mobile internet services. But just to kind of bring these points together here. So when we look at the overall levels of usage of different mobile internet services across the countries that we surveyed, So that is to say almost combining the previous two charts that we just looked at. This is combining all handset types together. We see that women are consistently using a substantially lower number of mobile internet and overall mobile services across low middle income countries, ranging from Mexico, where there's relative equality, albeit still a small gender gap, but through to Kenya, where women are using on average 30% fewer mobile use cases, and India, where they're using 44% fewer. So this really does translate into a gender gap, not just in ownership and adoption, but to actually the range and breadth of use cases that are being made use of by women. And then finally, I think one crucial thing to understand in the pathway to acquisition of a device here, and what is explaining this gender gap that we observe, is that our research found that women tended to be much less likely to be the decision makers in the acquisition of a smartphone. So we, amongst smartphone owners, we asked whether they had purchased their own device or whether they had got it through some other means, whether that be a gift or from work. And we found that men were much more likely to have purchased their own smartphone, with the most striking example of this being in Senegal, where 68% of men had purchased their own smartphone versus 26% of women. So of course, this can be for a variety of different reasons, but I think it's really crucial to have in mind, of course, women's lower levels of financial autonomy, which often means that they are perhaps not the ones that can be driving a large purchasing decision like this in the household. And so one consequence of this is that they are more likely to, if they have a device, if they have a phone, to have a lower cost phone with much lower levels of functionality, which, as we've observed previously, is something that is strongly associated with much lower levels of usage of mobile and consequently lower levels of benefit derived from connectivity. So we've looked a lot at the differences in male and female ownership and usage of mobile, but I think it's important just to close out by reflecting on why is this important to understand and to take action on. I think there's a few different pieces to this, but one thing that we focused on in this year's report is to try and understand what are some of the self-identified or rather, stated benefits to mobile ownership. So we asked both men and women a series of questions about what benefits they derive from mobile ownership. This was the percentage of female mobile owners who agreed with the following statement. And this is the median figure across the 15 countries that we surveyed. So across those countries, a median of 78% of women agreed that it helped them in their day-to-day work, studies or household chores, 76% that mobile ownership made them feel safer, and 82% that it provided access to useful information that is otherwise hard to get. And I think that final point is particularly important to bear in mind. Again, during this period of where access to information is particularly critical, and there may be much more limitation to where one can get information and can get access to accurate information. That benefit of mobile ownership is a really crucial one right now, albeit one that needs to be treated with caution, of course, when there is potential misinformation that can also be spread over mobile. And beyond those benefits to mobile ownership for individual women, it's also true that there are important commercial, social, and economic opportunities from closing the mobile gender gap. So in our 2019 study, last year's report, we calculated that across 5 years, the 5 years following the publication of that study, if mobile operators could close the gender gap in mobile ownership and use across low and middle income countries, this would represent a $140 billion commercial opportunity for the mobile industry. Likewise, it's also an important economic opportunity, whereby if only the mobile internet gender gap could be closed over that same time period, this would represent a $700 billion economic opportunity in terms of additional GDP growth. And I think, an even more important consideration now, as so many more economies are being forced into dependency on digital alternatives to regular means of interaction. And then, of course, beyond that, achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which many of which are supported or underpinned by connectivity in a variety of different ways. And of course, closing the mobile gender gap serves particularly to help to achieve SDG 5 on gender equality, but also supporting the eradication of poverty and spread of quality education, amongst others. So with that in mind, a few key takeaways from today's session. So 54% of women in low middle income countries are now using mobile internet, which is an incredible milestone, but women remain 20% less likely than men to use mobile internet. So really still a substantial inequality that needs to be addressed. There's promising progress being made with this gap closing quickly, but that's being driven primarily by South Asia, and we're still seeing a relatively static gap in many of the other regions, and indeed still a wide gap in South Asia as well. A few really key changes to be aware of is that women's levels of awareness and perception of the relevance of mobile internet is really increasing quickly, but cost and a lack of literacy and digital skills still remain absolutely key barriers to mobile ownership and mobile internet use. Video consumption is growing very, very quickly amongst both men and women, and provides a really accessible means of accessing relevant content, particularly for those who might have lower levels of literacy and digital literacy. But lower levels of smartphone ownership are still limiting women's use of mobile services, as smartphone ownership is associated with much higher levels of usage across a wide range of services. And then all of this is crucial to know because mobile ownership overall helps women to feel safer, more informed, and helps them in their day-to-day lives. Now, there's a wide range of actions that need to be taken to help to address the mobile gender gap. As I say, our program has been working on this for the last 10 years, and it is a stubborn problem that is not going to go away without concerted action. And indeed, this action is, as I've mentioned, ever more important given the increasing importance of digital connectivity right now, but also in the years to come as we become increasingly reliant on it and as societies and economies continue to further digitize. If we don't manage to close the mobile gender gap, there's a real risk that women's marginalized positions in many countries will not just be reinforced, but will be worsened further. To help to address the gender gap, we have some overall recommendations to a variety of different stakeholders, including to understand and address women's needs and barriers, and to consider the effects of social norms in particular, which may be hard to see, but often are a really, really crucial factor that underpin all of the barriers to equitable digital inclusion. Secondly, to ensure that women are involved as users in the design and implementation of products, services, and policies. So really making sure that women are listened to in the design of those solutions. And then to improve the quality and availability of gender disaggregated data, which can really consistently be something that is absent and something that prevents prompt action being taken, and to set gender equity targets on this data. And again, this is something that I think will be really important as we try to gather data on the gender disaggregated impact of COVID-19 and on how digital solutions can help to mitigate that. We also recommend that stakeholders look to the specific barriers that we've talked about through this presentation and try to understand what are the key barriers in their market and how can those barriers be addressed. In the full report, we present a full set of recommendations broken out by barrier and by stakeholder type. So I highly recommend that you take a look at the full report to see what are the most relevant recommendations for your organization. But to give a few examples of the types of actions that we see as important, when it comes to affordability, which, as I mentioned, is the most important barrier to mobile ownership for both men and women, and the second most important to mobile internet use. There's a lot to be done there, but one key example is to support industry efforts to lower the upfront cost of mobile handsets at the point of purchase, with a particular focus on 4G enabled devices such as smartphones, but also smart feature phones, which might be able to provide that connectivity at a much lower price. When it comes to literacy and digital skills, it's a difficult but important thing to address, it being the single main barrier when it comes to mobile internet use. Many things that can be done here, and it's important to involve a range of different stakeholders, but I think one key thing to consider is providing training to women and girls to improve their digital skills, including potentially digital skills in schools, and with a particular focus or the inclusion of mobile digital skills, where this is the primary means of internet connectivity for many women in low middle income countries. Third is safety and security, which, while not the top barrier overall, is still a really important consideration in many markets, and one that can disproportionately impact on women. Again, a lot to be done here, but one step that can be taken is developing applications, services, and other measures that can help women to feel safer online. Relevance, although slightly less important today when it comes to mobile internet, is still a really key consideration. So it's crucial that stakeholders communicate the relevance of mobile for women's day-to-day lives, including and in particular where it provides access to financial services, which may be of huge and disproportionate importance for women. And then finally, on accessibility, which is not one that we've discussed in too much detail here, but still a really crucial consideration in many cases, and would recommend ensuring that internet services and operating systems are available in local languages, as this can often be something that can prevent disproportionately women from using digital services. So I've run through the top level results of the report, but I do encourage you to go and read the full report. As you can see, much more country level data and much more depth on this topic. You can find the full report at gsma.com/r/gender-gap. Now, I'd be delighted to answer some questions, either those that you may have added during the presentation, or if you want to go and add some questions in the chat now. I would encourage anybody who goes to look at the report to also sign up to our Connected Women newsletter to get the latest on any of our work or publications from the Connected Women team. And if you have any questions after the webinar, do feel free to get in touch with me at oroundtree@gsma.com. So I will stop sharing my screen now so that I can look at those questions, and do type anything that you have in the chat now. Just scrolling back to the start of the questions, and apologies for any that I haven't been able to address as we go along. And thanks to Henriette for the kind words. Yeah, delighted to collaborate in any way that's possible. We are constantly working to address this and working on the ground with different mobile operators, but also different international organizations and stakeholders. So if you've not already, do sign up to our newsletter, and you can find the latest on what we're doing, and or get in touch if you have any specific ideas on how we might collaborate. To Judy, on the question of what I mentioned LTE enabled devices. So that is a 4G enabled handset device. So on the question of how the gender gap is calculated, so it is male ownership minus female ownership divided by male ownership. So indeed, it is not a percentage point gender gap, it is a relative gender gap. A question on how regular internet use is defined. Yeah, and that's a great question. I would agree that it is about the frequency and indeed intensity of use of mobile internet, but it's also kind of reflective of the range of different services that are being used. I'm not sure if apologies if you typed your questions in the Q&A section rather than in the chat section, but they may not be showing up for me. So you may want to just copy them over to the chat if I'm not getting to them. Jumping down to the bottom, just to answer some of the most recent questions. So in terms of who conducted these studies in each region and country, so this has all been conducted by the GSMA ourselves in partnership with Ipsos, our fieldwork partner for this research. So their field team. So this is all proprietary data. And whether there are any studies that have looked into age and the gender gap, it's not something that we have specifically published data on ourselves. We do tend to find that it can vary quite a lot from country to country. In general, gender gaps tend to be widest for the older population, but it can vary amongst the youngest population whether the gender gap is wider or smaller, particularly around the dynamics around marriage. Question on safety and security. Fanny, I don't know if you had anything specific in mind with your question. So I would encourage you to take a look at the full report where we do break out all of the barriers by country, and you can see some more detail on safety and security, specifically where it's particularly a consideration in Latin America. It doesn't emerge as the main barrier in many of the other countries that we look at, but I think it's really important to note here that what we're talking about is safety and security as a barrier to mobile ownership or mobile internet use. That's not to say that there aren't very real safety concerns for those who do own a device or get online. It's something that we've looked into in previous research as well, in a report on a couple of years ago on understanding the women's safety concerns around mobile. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that report if you're specifically interested in that topic. A question on what factors we took into consideration when we calculated the potential increase in GDP if the gender gap in mobile ownership and access to internet is closed. So this was an econometric model that was developed in partnership with our colleagues in the GSMA intelligence team at the GSMA. So really this was and indeed, these opportunities should be taken as indicative of the kind of scale that we're looking at. It was based on a study of the economic impact on GDP of a rise in broadband uptake based on a number of different academic studies on this topic. And so calculating what the level of broadband growth would be if the gender gap were closed and what the GDP increase that implied was. So it is not particularly looking into the mechanics by which that happens, but rather just looking based on the historic evidence around that gap. Now, apologies that I won't be able to get to all questions. I will do my best to follow up on any questions that that we don't manage to address today, but also feel free to email me directly if you have any pressing ones. Are the country breakdowns you showed today available in the report or online? Indeed, yes, everything, all of the country breakdowns that we showed today are available in the full report. How could we address the differences in motivation between men and women in the use of mobile internet? For example, lack of confidence in the use of the devices. So absolutely, that's a really critical question to answer. And, there's not necessarily an easy solution there. And we do see that lower levels of confidence is a prevalent factor amongst women in many markets that we look at, and I think a sensitivity by stakeholders to those factors is absolutely key. So whether that be providing hands-on support to people at the point of sale, which will provide a disproportionate benefit to women, ensuring that services interfaces are as simple as possible and very clearly communicate, for example, when data is being used, when a cost will be incurred. I think clarity and really trying to ensure simplicity and accessibility in how digital interfaces are presented are absolutely key and can have disproportionate impacts for women. I really just think the first step is sensitivity to this topic and a consideration of the gender impact of any of these actions being taken. But a great question, and indeed something that we publish quite a lot on around this. So I would recommend you taking a look at some of the other reports on our website if you're interested. We do indeed look at literacy as through our survey, and we do generally tend to find that literacy is, of course, a really key predictor of mobile internet use in particular. We actually included some data on this in our 2019 Mobile Gender Gap report, so I would encourage you to take a look at that. Whereas lower literacy levels on average for women are a factor in their lower levels of mobile ownership and mobile internet use, it is also true that even controlling for literacy, women tend to have lower levels of access and use. But yes, this is absolutely a key factor. We don't cover numeracy specifically in our survey, but also you're right, this is a key consideration. One question here on whether we can give more of a definition of services. Does that include agricultural services, for example, financial and insurance services? So yes, the kinds of services that we included in the survey specifically ranged from quite general ones around, say, video calling or messaging apps through to more specific ones, I believe, around gathering health information, and, for example, accessing government information through your mobile. So a wide range of services included in this survey. But of course, in general, yes, we would include all of those things when we talk about services. So, basic connectivity, but also all of the things that you can do on top of that. I'll just answer this final question on whether we asked phone owners if they have other ways to access the internet. So we did ask this question, and we found that amongst our sample, depending on country, a large proportion of respondents were only using the internet on a mobile phone. Very, very few people who used the internet on a computer did not use it on a mobile phone. So that was a very, very small proportion. But we generally observed a slightly higher level of dependence exclusively on mobile net use. So I'm running slightly over time already, so I will wrap things up there. And apologies again for those of you whose questions I did not manage to get to. Thanks for all of the fantastic discussion and questions in the chat. We will do our best to get back to you on your points offline. Thanks again for joining. I do hope this was of interest, and I do hope that you take the findings of this research away to your own organizations, as this is such a critical issue to be thinking about right now as we start to conceive of our response to COVID-19. And so do get in touch if you have any further questions, and I hope that you and your families remain safe and healthy. Thanks so much.